The Kurdistan Democratic Party, usually abbreviated as KDP or PDK, is one of the main Kurdish parties in Iraqi Kurdistan. It was founded in 1946 in Mahabad in Iranian Kurdistan. The party says it exists to combine democratic values and social justice to form a system whereby everyone in Kurdistan can live on an equal basis, with great emphasis given to rights of individuals and freedom of expression. History. Kurdistan Democratic Party, like most southern Kurdistani political parties, has a complicated history that is closely intertwined with both the politics of Baghdad and Iraq's neighbors, particularly Iran. Foundation. In 1946, the leader of the Soviet-backed Republic of Mahabad, Qazi Muhammad, announced the formation of a Kurdish Democratic Party, based in Iran, or Eastern Kurdistan, the Soviet Union, then supporting the Kurdish national struggle against the monarchies of Iran and Iraq, instructed Mustafa Barzani to place himself under the authority of Qazi Muhammad. It is not clear whether Mullah Mustafa ever formally agreed to this arrangement, but as a fugitive from Iraqi authorities he relied upon the goodwill of the Iranian Kurds and the Soviet backers, and local Kurds were ordered by the authority of the Republic of Mahabad to house and feed his destitute forces. It was well known in nationalist circles that the relations between the two men were not easy. Mullah Mustafa attempted to create a special dispensation for the Barzanis in Iran, but Qazi rebuffed them, stating, "There is to be only one party, and you must not operate separate from it." Quote. In the meantime, Mullah Mustafa was negotiating with Baghdad to allow his return to Iraq, and was successfully attempting to convince Iraqi Kurdish notables of the need for an Iraqi KDP. Rizgari, the Kurdish section of the Iraqi Communist Party, was vehemently opposed to the idea, as it would fracture the purpose of pan-Kurdish unity and give legitimacy to the Iraq-Iran border that divided Kurdistan. Nevertheless, Barzani's maneuverings were successful and he split Rizgari, gaining support even from committed leftists as due to the wide popularity Mullah Mustafa enjoyed amongst the common Kurdish people, and his position as chief notable of the tribal elders, who, it was argued, the nationalist movement needed on the side if it were to be militarily successful. The new KDP of Iraq held its first Congress in Baghdad on August 16, 1946. The 32 delegates elected a central committee with Hamza Abdallah as Secretary-General, Sheikh Latif and Kakazi Yadagar as vice-presidents, and Mullah Mustafa as president-in-exile. The party demanded autonomy for Iraqi Kurdistan, stating that the political and economic situation of the Kurds in Iraq was different from that of Iran. The party program was not specific about any social or economic content for fear of alienating the highly conservative tribal chiefs and landlords, who had agreed to support it. Consolidation. After the collapse of the Mahabad Republic in early 1947, Ibrahim Ahmad, previously the Sulaimaniya representative of the Iranian KDP, joined the Iraqi KDP. Ahmad was a highly influential leftist intellectual who by 1951 had succeeded in rallying most of the Iraqi Kurdish leftist nationalists to the KDP, which in turn took the opportunity to convene a second party congress and duly elect Ahmad as Secretary-General. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, the KDP and the Kurdish members of the Iraqi Communist Party steadily increased the working relationship, in many cases fielding joint candidates. The ICP campaigned directly against the Agas and won the support of the workers in the cities of Erbil, Duhok, and Sulaimaniya, while the KDP reassured the Agas that the ICP was ultimately under the control. By 1954 the KDP was advocating the replacement of the Iraqi monarchy with a popular democratic republic, much to the consternation of many of their tribal supporters. Indeed, in 1956, antagonism between the Kurdish Agas and the KDP-ICP reached such a height that emissaries for the former contacted the British consul in Mosul, requesting arms and finance to establish an anti-communist and independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Under revolutionary Iraq, on July 14, 1958, Brigadier Abd al-Karim Kashim and his fellow Free officers staged a successful coup that promised a brighter future for the Kurds of Iraq. Although the KDP and ICP were excluded from the new United National Front government, Kashim formed a three-man sovereignty council of a Sunni, a Shiite, and a Kurd. The KDP immediately pledged its support for the new regime, in its newspaper hailing a new era of freedom and equality for the Kurdish and Arab peoples. Ibrahim Ahmad attempted to pressure Kashim into including Kurdish autonomy in the Provisional Constitution. However, Kashim was under much greater pressure from his deputy Abdul Salam Arif and other pan-Arab nationalists, not least the Ba'ath, who wanted to take Iraq into the United Arab Republic. They objected to Kashim's apparently pro-Kurdish attitude and his friendliness towards Mustafa Barzani in particular. Kashim and Mullah Mustafa had developed a close relationship, as Kashim saw in Barzani a powerful military ally that he could employ as a counterweight to the pan-Arab nationalists who, he feared, threatened to subvert Iraq to Nasser's Egypt. Kashim had officially named him chairman of the KDP, gave him one of Nouri as-Sad's old residences in Baghdad, an automobile, and a handsome monthly stipend. Mullah Mustafa would prove his loyalty in March 1959, where he helped Kashim suppress a serious uprising in Mosul of pan-Arab nationalists and Ba'athist officers at the behest of Mullah Mustafa. Kurds, in tandem with the communists, attacked Mosul, wreaking havoc on nationalists and Ba'athists and killing as many as 2,500 people in 4 days, while the communists and Kurds settled scores. Kashim used the revolt as a pretext to purge nationalists and Ba'athists from the Iraqi armed forces and government. Kashim used an almost identical event that July, but this time in Kirkuk, as a pretext to act against the KDP's closest allies, the communists. In 1959, half of the 150,000 population of Kirkuk was Iraqi Turkmen, with the balance comprising Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, and Armenians. Mullah Mustafa's triumphal visit to the city the previous October had resulted in bloodshed, but this time killings were carried out by communist and Kurdish members of a group called the Popular Resistance Force, who attacked shops and their owners. As many as 50 Turkmen were killed. Kashim held the communists responsible and claimed to have uncovered plans for a similar action in Baghdad. During the next few months, Mullah Mustafa helped Kashim reduce the ICP, and there was open conflict in Iraqi Kurdistan between the KDP, backed by Kurdish tribesmen, and the Kurdish communists. Meanwhile, an ideological rift developed in the KDP between the intellectual and leftists Ibrahim Ahmad and Jalal Talabani on the one hand, and Mullah Mustafa and the Barzanis on the other. Mullah Mustafa talked freely, with a bitterness amounting to hatred, against the intellectual presumptuousness of the KDP politicians, singling out Ibrahim Ahmad for his particular dislike, while Ahmad complained of Mullah Mustafa's selfishness, arbitrariness, unfairness, tribal backwardness, and even his dishonesty. But while each wanted to reduce the other's influence in the KDP, each also knew that the other was indispensable in securing the loyalty of the respective support bases, the tribal villages and nomads for Barzani, and the urban and educated for Ahmad Talabani. During the 1950s, Mullah Mustafa strengthened his position by eliminating the forces of rival tribes, the Harkis, Sirchis, Barajustas, and Zabaris. Kashim urged restraint, but Mullah Mustafa pressed on regardless. A much intertribal bloodletting followed, eventually taking such scalps as Ahmad Muhammad Aga, chief of the Zabaris. As a result of this and past violence in Mosul and Kirkuk, Kashim slowly began to distance himself from the Mullah Mustafa and the KDP, and in a 1960 speech publicly disparaged the Barzani clan. Kashim feared Barzani hegemony, and began supporting the Harki and Zabari tribes against Mullah Mustafa. The Kurds, for their part, in particular Ibrahim Ahmad and Jalal Talabani, felt increasingly frustrated that Kashim had taken no practical steps towards Kurdish autonomy. Kurdistan slowly and almost inadvertently headed towards revolt, and between 1961 and 1963, violence engulfed Kurdistan, and the long-standing divisions between the socialist nationalists such as Talabani and Mullah Mustafa and the old tribal Aga solidified as they disagreed as to how to conduct the revolt and for what purpose. Mullah Mustafa unsuccessfully sought the assistance first of Britain, and then the USA, which lost him any of the remaining allies he had in the Iraqi Communist Party. The whole country descended into chaos as a quarter of the villages of Kurdistan were attacked and 80,000 refugees created. Kashim not only lost control of the mountains of Kurdistan, but was being isolated politically in Baghdad by the pan-Arab nationalists, and it seemed only a matter of time before he lost power. Early Ba'ath Party rule, the KDP, together with many other Kurds, welcomed the February 1963 Iraqi Kurdistan.It, believing the various Ba'ath assurances that Kurdish autonomy would be guaranteed. Unfortunately for the Kurds, the zeitgeist had thoroughly turned against them. As in Baghdad, there was a widespread belief that they were being used as a Trojan horse by either Iran, the West, or both. Negotiations on the status of Kurdistan deadlocked, especially over the statuses of Kirkuk. The KDP demanded control over the city and its rich oil fields, whereas the government countered that the 1947 census showed that Kurds made up only 25% of the population of the city, and Iraqi Turkmen over half. Mullah Mustafa threatened war, and Baghdad took up the challenge. Ba'ath troops occupied Sulaymaniyah and declared martial law and a curfew, rounding up political leaders and activists. 3 days later, when martial law was lifted, 80 bodies were found in a mass grave and hundreds more went missing. Kurdish delegates were arrested throughout Iraq, and the intellectuals of the KDP quarreled with Mullah Mustafa over his tactics. The first Ba'ath government was overthrown and replaced by a National Command of the Revolutionary Council, led by Abdul Salam Arif. While this regime's ideology was essentially the same, it favored peace with the Kurds as the war had been costly and unpopular. Indeed, Arif had contacted Mullah Mustafa before the coup in order to elicit his cooperation to resist the Ba'ath offensive until he could oust them himself. Mullah Mustafa signed an agreement with Arif in his personal capacity, rather than as president of the KDP. This infuriated Ibrahim Ahmad and Jalal Talabani, as the agreement omitted any mention of self-administration, let alone autonomy, the whole point for which they had been fighting. Arif threatened force against any Kurdish opponent of Mullah Mustafa, while Mullah Mustafa declared that any resistance to Baghdad would constitute a declaration of war against himself and the Barzanis. Mullah Mustafa informed Arif that he had no objection to the abolition of Kurdish political parties, so long as it served the interests of Iraq, and began to receive arms and funds from Abdul Salam Arif. Yet again, the Kurdish political scene was divided between the intelligentsia of Ibrahim Ahmad and Jalal Talabani, who decried this complicity, and as they saw its submission to Baghdad, and Mullah Mustafa, who rallied the conservatives and tribal leaders to his side. Furious debates and campaigning followed, but Ahmed's and Talabani's arguments could not dislodge Mullah Mustafa's position as the popular figurehead of the Kurdish people. Mullah Mustafa would accept not dissent, and, fearing for their lives, Ahmed and his followers slipped away at night from a heated discussion with Mullah Mustafa, and retreated back to the stronghold in Mahabad. At the Sixth Party Congress of the KDP in July 1964, representatives from the armored Talabani faction were promptly arrested upon arrival. A few days later, Mullah Mustafa sent his son, Idris Bizani, with a large force to drive Ahmed Talabani and the 4,000 Issa followers into exile in Iran. With that, Mullah Mustafa had finally achieved undisputed control of the KDP. In the ensuing 4 years until the next Ba'ath coup, the Kurds continued the guerrilla war against the Iraqi regime. By 1966, Mullah Mustafa had enlisted the support of Baghdad's two foremost ideological enemies, Iran and Israel. He believed these two countries, in addition to the United States, would ultimately help him win independence from Baghdad. In 1968, the second Ba'ath coup was successful, and an agreement called the Bazaz Declaration was reached between the KDP and the Ba'ath. Although Ba'ath party founder Michel Aflaq called for equal rights for all ethnic and religious minorities under Arab rule, in practice the new regime ultimately became more chauvinist than any before. The Arab nationalists had not forgotten the atrocities they suffered at the hands of the Mullah Mustafa and the Bizanis in 1959. Ironically, one of the Ba'ath's leading advocates of a more considered and amenable approach to the Kurdish question in these early days was Saddam Hussein. Ahmed and Talabani also welcomed the new Ba'ath regime, as they felt more at home with its socialist ethos than any previous Baghdad government. Nevertheless, Baghdad was growing apprehensive with regards to Iran's continued involvement in Kurdistan, including supplying sophisticated artillery to Mullah Mustafa, and its recent claim to sovereignty over Bahrain, in an attempt both at appeasement and to undermine the growing strength of Mullah Mustafa. The Ba'ath government declared its commitment to the 1968 Bazaz Declaration and announced that Kurdish should be taught in all Iraqi schools and universities, that a new Kurdish university was to be established in Suleymania, and that Nowruz was to be recognized as a national holiday. Mullah Mustafa pressed on regardless, and shelled the government's oil installations in Kirkuk, much to the embarrassment of Baghdad internationally, particularly with the British-owned Iraqi Petroleum Company. Talabani and Ahmed then sought the endorsement of the new Ba'ath regime, presenting themselves as both more responsible leaders and closer in ideology to the Ba'ath. In reality, both Mullah Mustafa and Ahmed Talabani jostled for influence and recognition from Baghdad. President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was trying to consolidate his power in Arab Iraq, especially against the communists, so he ordered his deputy Saddam Hussein to travel to Kurdistan to reach a peace agreement with the Kurds. In 1970, Saddam traveled to Kurdistan to conclude an accord with Mullah Mustafa. A truly democratic, federalist, and equitable 15-point agreement was reached, and the accord concluded with the statement, "History will bear witness that you did not have and never will have as sincere a brother and dependable an ally as the Arab people." The peace didn't last long. As might be expected, the earliest obstacle was the demographic one. In 1972, when the government proposed to apply the 1957 census figures to Kirkuk, Mullah Mustafa rejected it, knowing that it would show the Iraqi Turkmen were the majority in the city, and given the events of 1959, the Turkmen were likely to prefer Ba'ath rule to Kurdish. Mullah Mustafa refused to close the border with Iran as he had agreed to, and appealed appealed to the United States for aid despite promising not to seek outside assistance. Moreover, by mid-September 1972, Mullah Mustafa was receiving a $50,000 stipend from Israel to distract and undermine the Ba'ath. Meanwhile, the government nationalized the country's oil facilities, provoking Kurdish fears that they would lose out on their own oil resources. Rhetoric on both sides intensified, and there were clashes in Kirkuk and Sinjar. Mullah Mustafa boasted to the Washington Post in June 1973, "We are ready to act according to U.S. policy, if the U.S. protect us from the wolves. In the even of sufficient support, we should be able to control the Kirkuk oil fields and confer exploitation rights on an American company." Conflict was thus inevitable. Iraqi planes bombed Kurdish positions, while Mullah Mustafa mobilized his forces and warned of all-out war. Saddam decided not to go to war after negotiating with Iran for a possible cessation of their aid to the KDP. Mullah Mustafa increased his demands to proposing Kirkuk as the capital of an autonomous Kurdistan. Nevertheless, in October the Ba'ath announced its decision to go ahead with a draft autonomy law under the auspices of discussion with 600 anti-Barzani Kurds. The Ba'ath were willing to ignore the KDP if necessary. Warm discussions between Kurdish socialists and communists and the Ba'ath angered Mullah Mustafa, and his Savak-trained security force, the Paristan, began rounding up and murdering Kurdish communists. Negotiations dragged on, but Mullah Mustafa was unwilling to budge on Kirkuk, despite being advised to do so by his own European advisors. On March 11, 1974, Baghdad published its autonomy law, and gave Mullah Mustafa a fortnight in which to accept it and join the Ba'ath National Front. The territory allotted to the Kurds under this agreement is roughly analogous to the KRG of today. Emboldened by offers of support from the USA, Israel, and Iran, Mullah Mustafa allowed the deadline to expire. This caused several high-ranking KDP Politburo members to defect to the Iraqi National Front in Baghdad. The most significant of these defections was that of Mullah Mustafa's eldest son, Ubayd al-Barzani, who claimed that his father does not want self-rule to be implemented even if he were given Kirkuk and all of its oil. His acceptance of the law will take everything from him, and he wants to remain absolute ruler, further condemning his father for failing to implement agrarian reform. Around the same time, a section of the KDP split to join the Ba'ath-sponsored National Progressive Front. 1974-75 war with approximately 50,000 trained Peshmerga and possibly another 50,000 irregulars at his disposal. Mullah Mustafa was confident in the face of an Iraqi military assault against such a force Baghdad could deploy 90,000 troops, but importantly backed by over 1,200 tanks and armored vehicles, and 200 aircraft. With Iranian, as well as covert American and Israeli support, the Peshmerga were able to combat the technologically superior Iraqi army. Iranian support ended when it reached an agreement with Iraq during the OPEC conference in March 1975, encouraged by the United States, culminating in the 1975 Algiers Agreement. Unable to continue receiving ammunition for its anti-air and anti-armor weaponry, Mullah Mustafa ordered the KDP to begin retreating to avoid repercussions from the Iraqi army. 200,000 Kurdish refugees fled to Iran, and there were somewhere in the region of 20,000 casualties on each side. After its suppression of the armed resistance, the Ba'ath razed at least 1,400 villages to create a security belt along the Turkish and Iranian borders. At least least 600,000 civilians were deported to collective resettlement camps, with anyone caught trying to abandon these camps being executed on the spot. The Iraqi government also used this opportunity to settle demographic scores in the favor, resettling Kurds from disputed territories and moving in Arab families in the place. The Ba'ath even offered financial incentives to Arabs who took Kurdish wives. Mullah Mustafa fled to Iran, and Saddam Hussein, who had initially been somewhat of a dove on the Kurdish question, was radicalized by the Kurdish insurrection with the help of Iran, a country and culture for whom he held a lifelong hatred. Under Saddam Hussein, in the wake of the defeat during the 1974–1975 war, Mustafa Barzani and his sons Idris and Masoud fled to Iran. The power vacuum they left behind was thus filled by their ideological nemesis Jalal Talabani, who, together with his leftist supporters, announced in Damascus the formation of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. By 1976, Idris and Masoud Barzani were beginning to regroup in Europe, launching the KDP Provisional Leadership. The Provisional Leadership repositioned itself formally as a leftist organization. Mahmoud Uthman took control of operations in Iraqi Kurdistan until 1979. Masoud Barzani returned from Iran after the death of his father and assumed the leadership of the party. Despite the terrible hardships suffered by the Kurds as a whole, intra-Kurdish feuding did not cease following the 1974–1975 war, as KDP groups ambushed and killed PUK fighters on several occasions in 1976–1977. Talabani vowed revenge, and at various moments ordered his troops to fire upon any KDP troops, but suffered from operational weaknesses compared to the KDP. Feuding and splitting continued throughout the late 1970s as the KDP, PUK, and KDP-I jostled for influence and funding from neighboring states. At the commencement of the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein was able to publicly boast that the Kurdish organizations would never be able to achieve anything since they're hopelessly divided against each other and subservient to foreign powers. Quote, in April 1981, the KDP, Iraqi Communist Party, and a newly formed Kurdish Socialist Party colluded to attack PUK positions in Erbil Governorate. The following month the PUK counterattacked, killing 50 communists and capturing another 70. Each party accused the other of being in the pocket of Baghdad, and even Ankara. Iran started to work closer with the KDP against Saddam's Iraq, and by 1983 the threat of an Iranian incursion into Iraq via Kurdistan became a real one. The KDP allowed Iran to seize the famous Iran-Iraq border crossing of Haji Omaran, a move that one Western diplomat called a stab in the back Saddam will never forget. Subsequently, Saddam gained his vengeance on the Barzani clan. 8,000 Barzani males, including pro-government Jash, were abducted and paraded through the streets of Baghdad before being executed. Meanwhile, the PUK had announced a ceasefire with Baghdad in order to consolidate its recent territorial gains. The move backfired, as over 3,000 PUK fighters defected to the KDP in order to continue to war against Saddam, as Saddam was assured of support both financial and militarily in his war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, not only from the USA, but from France, Britain, and the USSR. The Kurdish groups eventually came to the realization that they must unite against the common foe. In 1986 the KDP, PUK, KSP, and ICP announced a joint declaration calling for unity against the Ba'ath regime, and in November Masoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani finally met to form an official alliance. In Tehran, by May 1987, the KPDP, PASOK, Kurdistan Toilers Party, and the Assyrian Democratic Movement all joined what was known as the Kurdistan Front, and now all Kurdish parties were receiving monetary and military support from Iran, with the Kurds in a seemingly stronger position than in any time since the 1960s, and the betrayal in the mind of Saddam complete. Large-scale repression commenced. In Sulaymaniyah, Saddam rounded up 500 male children aged 10 to 14, and had a substantial number of them tortured before being killed. The KDP and PUK received advanced weaponry from Iran, such as SAM-7 missiles, that allowed them for the first time in decades to capture and hold military centers and civilian territory from the Iraqi army. As Saddam felt increasingly threatened, he commissioned his cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, also known as Chemical Ali, for his use of chemical weapons against Kurdish towns such as Halabja, to launch the Al-Anfal campaign. Thousands of Kurdish villages were destroyed, and at least 180,000 civilians perished.